Robb Stark stood by a narrow window in the ancient halls of Winterfell, his breath clouding against the cold stone. The sunlight was thin, filtered through pale clouds, but enough to reveal the tension in his gray-blue eyes. He was alone, for now alone with his thoughts and the weight of a kingdom upon his shoulders. His father's death still echoed in every corridor, in the hushed whispers of the bannermen and the hollow quiet that trailed the Stark family. Robb was young, far younger than he felt, and the crown of the king in the north rested heavily upon him. He had led armies, sworn his sword, and tasted the heartbreak of betrayal. But now he faced a new decision, one that neither sword nor shield could entirely defend him from: marriage. The notion had not come from him but from his advisors, his mother's urgings, his uncle's counsel, the quiet yet persistent suggestions of the lords sworn to Winterfell's cause. A marriage alliance, they all said, would give the North a stronger foundation in the storm-ridden chaos of the War of the Five Kings. House Baratheon loomed as a possibility. Stannis Baratheon might be distant, hard, and often as cold as the northern snows, but no one questioned his iron will or his sense of justice. For many, the idea of wedding Robb to Shireen, the only daughter of Stannis, was unthinkable. Shireen was a child scarred by grayscale, shy and tucked away in Dragonstone's shadows. But in a world torn by war, new precedents could be forged in desperate times. The match, improbable though it seemed, carried with it the promise of a pact between North and Stormlands, two great territories with proud histories and unbreakable convictions. Robb's mother, Catelyn Stark, was the first to raise the possibility with him. He remembered how she had sat with him in the Godwood, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and the hush of the old god's presence among the weirwood trees. "We need allies we can trust, Robb," she had said, her eyes wet with both sorrow and determination. "We cannot stand alone while the Lannisters, the Freys, and the other great houses shift like shadows on the board. The Baratheons might be our best chance to bring some stability. Stannis has declared himself the rightful king. We have declared ourselves separate from the Iron Throne. An alliance could keep the North safe while we figure out how to handle the ever-shifting tides of war." He had listened in silence, reflecting on the countless responsibilities thrust upon him. He had never met Shireen in person, but he knew from rumors and scattered accounts that she was only a few years younger than himself, that she had a reserved smile and a soul shaped by solitude. She had grown under the grim discipline of her father and the watchful eye of her mother, Lady Celis Florent. Shireen was said to be kind, gentle, but lonely, an unlikely candidate for a queen's role, some might say. But Robb had seen enough violence and cruelty to understand that gentleness could be a rare and valuable balm in such desperate times. The seed of the idea took root in his mind, and by the time the crows carried letters from Dragonstone to Winterfell, acceptance swelled inside him like the slow bloom of spring in the north. When word came that Stannis was open to the alliance, everything moved quickly. More ravens flew between the two seats of power, words of negotiation forging a bond that steel could not. Robb thought of his father, Ned Stark, and what he would have wanted. Ned had always believed in doing the honorable thing, even if it was the most difficult. Marriage for love might have been the ideal, but marriage for the good of the realm was a tradition as old as the Seven Kingdoms themselves. And if Shireen Baratheon's gentle spirit could help quell the endless strife, perhaps this was the best path. So he signed the agreements, sealed them with the dire wolf of House Stark, and prepared to cross into unfamiliar territory as he traveled south. Their wedding would be held at Storm's End, the ancestral seat of House Baratheon. From there, a new union between the North and the Stormlands would be proclaimed to the entire realm. The journey south was a long one, made more so by the heaviness of purpose. Robb rode at the head of a contingent of loyal northern lords, Roose Bolton and his retinue, though the man's presence always left a chill in the air, the great Jon Umber, loud and proud, regaling the company with stories meant to lift spirits, and many other bannermen who believed in the king in the north. Alongside them was Catelyn Stark, for she insisted upon seeing her son wed. She was the cornerstone of his support, the quiet wisdom in his ear that guided him through the labyrinth of war and alliances. As they traveled past Moat Cailin, down the King's Road, and over the rolling hills that marked the southern territories, Robb felt a conflicted unease. The north was in his blood, its wintry starkness, its gray skies, its austere sense of right and wrong. Even to secure an alliance, he worried about taking the step that might lead him away from the ideals he cherished. But each night as he lay under the stars, he reminded himself that he was not abandoning his father's teachings. He was honoring them. His father had valued peace, loyalty, and the well-being of the people of the North. If wedding Shireen Baratheon made that possible, then he would do his duty. Word had it that Stannis Baratheon would not attend the wedding himself. He was occupied with war councils and perhaps reluctant to leave Dragonstone. The prospective bride, Shireen, had arrived at Storm's End accompanied by her mother and a small host. Storm's End was the ancient fortress that had stood against endless storms and sieges alike. Its thick walls of stone appeared to defy the raging sea and howling winds, a testament to the unwavering resilience of the Baratheon line. Inside its walls, the castle bustled with a mixture of northern guests and Stormlander lords preparing for the ceremony. Most were uncertain, torn between curiosity and hope, wondering if this match could indeed forge a lasting peace or if it was simply another frail attempt in a realm battered by ceaseless war. Robb Stark arrived after a hard ride on a late afternoon when the sky was tinged with bruised clouds. Gulls circled overhead, screeching their welcomes or warnings. Salty wind whipped at the banners that hung from the castle walls, the direwolf of Stark and the crowned stag of Baratheon side by side. Within the yard, he was greeted by Shireen's mother, Lady Sellis, whose polite words barely masked her nervousness. A hush seemed to fall over the courtyard. Robb was aware that hundreds of eyes were on him, silently judging if the king in the north was truly capable of uniting these two realms. When he finally laid eyes on Shireen, she stood near the grand doors of Storm's End's main hall, flanked by her septa and a pair of Stormlander guards. Her face was partially in shadow, obscuring the gray-scale scars that marked her left cheek. A flicker of uncertainty shone in her blue eyes, yet she did not shy away. Robb was struck by the sense of quiet fortitude in her stance. She curtsied with a gentle grace, the whisper of her pale blue gown almost lost in the wind. He bowed in return and took her hand. The warmth of her small fingers felt fragile yet steady in his own. Here was a girl forced to grow up in a place of gloom and duty, a child who might have retreated from a world that deemed her disfigured. But Robb saw kindness in her eyes, and for a moment the swirl of war and ambition and alliance hushed. They were simply two people, both lonely in their own ways, drawn together by fate and the burdens placed upon them by their families' names. They exchanged small greetings and formalities, too stiff and polite, both uncertain of the other. Shireen spoke softly, acknowledging that she hoped the wedding would bring peace, that it would ease the tension her father felt and the uncertainty that had seized the realm. Robb nodded, giving her a gentle smile, trying to reassure her that he harbored no resentment or fear over her scars. The grayscale had long been stopped, and it was but a cosmetic mark now, though it caused many to avert their gaze. He did not. He looked directly at her, letting her see that he was not repelled, that this union meant more to him than mere politics. She blinked at him, surprised but grateful, and in that moment, something like true understanding glimmered between them. Preparations for the wedding consumed the following days. The halls of Storm's End bustled with an array of guests, northern lords in thick furs clashing with Stormlander knights in sea-salty cloaks, courtiers whispering about the significance of the wedding. A throng of servants and squires and cooks, all toiling under the supervision of Lady Sellis, who wanted everything perfect. A hush of war still lingered in the corners, though. The War of the Five Kings had not ceased. Stannis's men whispered of battles at Blackwater and in the Crownlands. Robb's men whispered of skirmishes near the Neck and the uncertain alliances that might break at any moment. Yet for these precious days, the wedding overshadowed all else. If only for one fleeting instant, feasts and dances and blessings took precedence over bloodshed and fear. Catelyn Stark spent every spare moment with her son, reminding him of the protocols and gently chastising him about the subtle responsibilities that come with marrying a young lady from another great house. She also sought to spend time with Shireen, teaching the girl small courtesies of the North, offering a motherly presence that Shireen had perhaps never fully received from her own mother. Shireen's timid smile would grow in such moments, and sometimes Robb would watch from a distance, imagining a future in which Shireen was free of the gloom that had always enveloped her. He couldn't deny a budding sense of protectiveness. The ceremony itself was held in the great hall of Storm's End. The ocean winds rattled the windows and the distant crash of waves thundered on the sturdy walls. At the appointed hour, the officiant stood before them, speaking solemn words of union, speaking of the old gods and the new, bridging traditions to accommodate both northern and southern beliefs. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows that made the hall seem alive with ghosts of the past. Robb wore a tunic of gray wool trimmed with white fur, the direwolf embroidered proudly on his breast. Shireen wore a pale gown that shimmered like sea foam, her hair braided in a modest style with small, carefully chosen pearls. Her cheeks flushed pink and her eyes darted occasionally to where her mother stood, but she did not tremble. She held her head high, and her voice, though soft, was firm as she spoke her vows. When Robb slid the ring upon her finger, he felt the hush of the hall shift as though the entire realm held its breath. He looked at Shireen and saw tears glistening at the corners of her eyes, not tears of fear, but of wonder. Despite the swirl of politics that had brought them to this moment, there was sincerity, a promise spoken not only by their lips but by their hearts. They kissed, chaste and fleeting, and the hall erupted into applause. The pact was sealed. The North and the Stormlands were united, at least in name, under the auspices of a gentle, untested queen and a king who bore more scars in his soul than on his flesh. That evening, the feast was grand. Tables sagged under roasted boar, fresh fish, spiced cakes, and flagons of mead and strong wine. Musicians played lively tunes and dancers wove patterns on the rush-strewn floor. Robb was expected to mingle, to offer toasts, and to present himself as the strong, wise king in the North. Shireen sat at his side, shy but increasingly radiant as the night wore on. She listened to the boisterous laughter of northern lords, the proud boasts of Stormlander knights, and the quieter, more cunning whispers of courtiers from both realms. Each time she stole a glance at Robb, he offered her a gentle smile, a silent reassurance that she was welcome in his world. Caitlin sat to her other side, kindly guiding her through the intricacies of feasting etiquette, occasionally leaning over to explain a reference or introduce her to a lesser lord. When Shireen dared to laugh at some small jest, Robb felt his heart lighten as though the entire hall glowed a touch brighter. But even on this night of celebration, the memory of war hovered around the edges. Roose Bolton observed the festivities with his unsettling calm. The Greyjoy's raucous laughter could not entirely drown out the undercurrent of talk about the battles yet to come. Lady Sellis' expression remained pinched, as though she couldn't quite reconcile the idea of her only child wed to a northern king she hardly knew. Ravens arrived with news, though no one dared spoil the wedding with fresh tidings of bloodshed. Tension lingered, but for the moment, the feast held the illusions of peace together. Now was the time for newlyweds to savor a moment of respite, even if the world outside Storm's End stood poised to devour all tranquility. Later that night, in the chamber prepared for them, Robb and Shireen were left alone. A single candle on the table flickered, casting shifting gold light across their faces. The hush was thick and a little uncertain. Shireen stood by the window looking out at the Black Sea. The distant roar of waves battered the walls. She turned to Robb with an expression that spoke of nerves and quiet hope. Robb approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He felt her trembling. He knew the wedding night was a dreaded prospect for some brides, especially those who barely knew the man they were to call husband. He did not want to frighten her. Instead, he found himself whispering, "We'll take our time. We'll do this together." She nodded, her voice a breathy whisper. "I want to be a good wife. I want to help you, to help the North, help my father, but everything feels so large." Robb's heart twisted, remembering his own youth before war, before crowns, and the sense of being swept up in events far beyond himself. He gently drew her into an embrace. "We'll face it together," he said again, more firmly. "For the good of our people and for ourselves." The candlelight softened the lines of her grayscale scars, and he found that he barely noticed them, focusing instead on the curious brightness in her eyes. In that moment, they both seemed younger and infinitely more vulnerable than the official titles and responsibilities strapped to them. They were simply two young souls trying to find solace in a realm of strife. When he finally lifted her chin and kissed her, it was gentle, warm, and she relaxed by increments, leaning into his touch. Whatever else would come in the future, for that night they allowed themselves the fragile seed of hope. In the days that followed, their marriage sparked new gossip throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Rumors circulated among the Lannisters and Tyrells, at the twins with Walder Frey, and across the sea. Some scoffed at the notion that a meek, scarred girl like Shireen could wield any influence in the North. Others whispered that the Baratheons had cunningly embedded themselves into northern politics, forging a union that might strengthen Stannis' claim against the Iron Throne. Yet among the common folk, farmers, fisherfolk, villagers, there was a sense of cautious optimism. Perhaps, they said, two houses so famed for their honor and resilience might bring an end to the bloodshed. Perhaps the marriage was a sign that the realm need not be doomed to endless war. Robb and Shireen did not linger indefinitely at Storm's End. After a short spell of celebrations and formalities, they prepared to journey back north, for Robb could not abandon his armies or the land he pledged to protect. Caitlin, satisfied that the wedding had gone smoothly, readied herself to return as well. Lady Sellis parted from Shireen with tense formality, reminding her daughter of her duties, of the expectations placed upon her to represent House Baratheon with pride in the north. Shireen, in turn, delivered a quiet promise. "I will do my best." She tried to hide the tears that threatened to blur her vision, for she loved her mother even if they never quite understood each other. When at last they mounted their horses and turned their train northward, the winds raged around Storm's End as though in farewell. Traveling the King's Road back to Winterfell was an enlightening experience for Shireen. She rode beside Robb whenever possible, sometimes sharing a horse with him when the path grew too muddy. The further they traveled, the colder the nights became. She discovered that the north was broader and more majestic than stories had told her. Rolling hills turned to dense forests of pines and oaks. Streams trickled with crystalline water. Above them, the sky opened wide, an endless gray vault during the day, a tapestry of stars at night. Shireen found herself smiling more often than she ever had in Dragonstone or Storm's End. When she confided this to Robb, he chuckled softly. "The north grows on you," he said. "Even when it's cold, it welcomes you in its own way." The travel was not without its perils. Robb's bannermen had scouts roving ahead to ensure that no Lannister forces or Ironborn raiders lurked along the route. They encountered a few bandits, desperate men who quickly fled at the sight of armed soldiers. In the evenings, Shireen would watch the northern lords gather around the campfires, listening to stories of the old heroes of Winterfell, Bran the Builder, the Kings of Winter, and the tales of legendary battles against wildlings and others. She found it all both intimidating and captivating. Back in Dragonstone, her father had rarely regaled her with stories. He was a man of few words, overshadowed by his grim sense of duty. Now, Shireen felt as though the tapestry of the world was unfolding before her eyes. And at its center was her new husband, the king in the north, who managed to make her laugh softly when he teased her about the distinct hush that always followed whenever she approached the more boisterous men. By the time they reached Winterfell, the castle gates opened in a welcome that made Shireen's heart pound. The towering walls of gray stone bore centuries of history. The courtyard bustled with life. Direwolf's sigils fluttered in the wind. Shireen saw stable-hands, guards, small folk all pausing in their tasks to witness the arrival of their king and his new bride. Shireen kept her chin up, though her cheeks burned at the attention. Robb guided her through the archway and helped her dismount as many curious eyes watched. Then, with a gentle hand on her back, he led her up the steps to the Great Hall. This was her new home. A flurry of introductions followed. Ser Roderick Castle approached first, bowing deeply to Shireen, addressing her as "my queen," which sent shivers of both awe and anxiety through her. Maester Luwin, wise and kind, offered a bow and a few words of welcome, promising to provide any counsel she might need. The staff of Winterfell's kitchens and the steward all looked on with curiosity, some with warm smiles, others with guarded neutrality. At every turn, Shireen felt the enormity of the role she was expected to play. She was no longer simply Stannis Baratheon's shy daughter. She was Queen to the North, a lady of Winterfell. What that truly meant, she would soon discover. Robb showed her around the castle grounds over the next days. He led her to the Godwood where the weirwood tree stood in silent watch. The pool's surface reflected the red leaves above, eating a sense of timeless stillness. Shireen felt a solemn presence there, something profound. She and Robb exchanged few words in that sacred place. Instead, they clasped hands, letting the quiet speak for them. On another day, he introduced her to Grey Wind, his dire wolf, a hulking creature with intelligent, gold-green eyes. Shireen stifled a gasp of surprise at first, then cautiously reached out to pet Grey Wind's thick fur. The dire wolf sniffed her hand and allowed the touch to Robb's delight. A sense of acceptance formed then. The dire wolf of House Stark acknowledged the queen. What Shireen truly longed for, though, was to be of use. She had grown up shadowed by her father's convictions, by Dragonstone's bleakness, always feeling a step behind others. Now she was in a position to help rule an entire kingdom, one that needed leadership in the face of war, famine, and uncertainty. She asked Robb how she might learn, how she could lend her voice to councils. Robb, somewhat hesitant at first, realized that she was sincere. "You will sit beside me," he told her. "You will see what I see, hear what I hear. Your counsel is welcome." And so she began attending meetings, quietly absorbing the talk of supply lines, troop movements, alliances, and strategies for the ongoing conflict. The presence of a new queen did not pass without complications. Many of the northern lords were traditional, preferring a northern bride for their king. Some whispered that she was too meek, that her father was an outsider who cared little for the old gods. Others voiced hope that Stannis' sense of justice might support Robb's cause. Shireen encountered suspicion, courtesy, and everything in between. Yet she pressed on, determined to learn and to serve. She spent time with Maester Luwin, reading old chronicles about the Starks, the rebellion, and the wars that had shaped the Seven Kingdoms. When lords came to request audience with Robb, she sat quietly, listening to their pleas about harvests, about bandits, about the threat of the Ironborn along the coast. Little by little, she began to discover the heartbeat of the North, proud, stern, loyal, but also weary from endless fighting. Her relationship with Robb likewise deepened slowly, like roots seeking fertile soil. They were both new to each other, unaccustomed to the nuances of a marriage built on alliance rather than romance. Yet they found small moments that bridged the gap. Evening walks on the battlements where Shireen would ask questions about the old battles once fought on these very walls. Early mornings when Robb would rise to oversee training in the yard and Shireen, bleary-eyed, would watch from a window admiring his dedication. Sometimes he'd catch her gaze and beckon her down, showing her how the men sparred, encouraging her to hold a wooden sword just for the sense of it. She giggled awkwardly when the heavy blade wobbled in her grip and Robb's eyes glowed with gentle amusement. Their marriage might have begun as a tool of diplomacy, but each day it became more personal, more real. Catelyn Stark observed it all with cautious optimism. She saw how her son's face softened when Shireen walked into the room. She noted how Shireen's nerves eased when Robb was near, but she also bore the scars of betrayal, and she urged Robb to be wise and careful. "The girl is innocent," she told him, "but her father's war is not. We must keep our eyes open." Robb nodded, admitting that he would not let sentiment cloud his judgment. Still, he could not deny that Shireen's presence brought a measure of peace to his heart. She had become the gentleness in a world that offered him only duty and violence. Soon enough, war's harsh demands tore at any tranquility they might have savored. Messages arrived detailing the movements of Lannister forces near Harrenhal, the Greyjoy raids on the North's coast, and the uncertain loyalty of certain houses that might bend the knee to the highest bidder. Council after council met in Winterfell's Great Hall, with northern lords and some Stormlander knights who had accompanied Shireen. They debated strategies and supply lines. Shireen sat beside Robb, her hands folded in her lap, listening attentively. She spoke up rarely, knowing her inexperience, but each time she did, she reminded them of the simple realities often overlooked. The plight of the small folk, the need to preserve farmland, the importance of ensuring that soldiers had enough to eat. Her voice, so mild in timbre, came from a place of concern rather than ambition, and it gradually earned the respect of many who initially dismissed her. Then came the summons from Stannis Baratheon, carried by a grim-faced courier who looked as though the journey had stolen all his cheer. Stannis wrote to Robb and Shireen, requesting that they send envoys to Dragonstone to discuss a joint offensive against King's Landing. If Robb had any intention of pressing south again, Stannis wanted to coordinate. The letter was as rigid and terse as the man himself, but the underlying sentiment was clear. Stannis recognized Robb as an ally, one he needed if he hoped to topple the Lannisters. More subtly, it also implied that Shireen was a bond between them. Stannis' daughter was now queen in the north, bridging father and son-in-law whether they liked it or not. Robb consulted his council, and they agreed to dispatch a small delegation, though he himself could not leave the north undefended. The war had changed, but Robb's responsibilities had not. He had to keep the north safe. He had battles of his own to wage against the Ironborn who still terrorized coastal villages and the possibility of betrayal from certain houses that might side with the Lannisters. Shireen wanted to go with the envoys, to see her father and reassure him of her marriage's success. But Robb hesitated. Letting his queen sail into uncertain waters felt perilous. In the end, they compromised. Shireen would remain at Winterfell while a trusted lord and a few Stormlander knights traveled to Dragonstone. She accepted it, albeit reluctantly, and wrote her father a careful, thoughtful letter, detailing some of what she had learned of the North and pledging her unwavering support. As the war's storms continued to brew, Shireen became more involved in the day-to-day governance of Winterfell. She rose early to meet with the castle's steward about provisions. She listened to the concerns of small folk who trickled in seeking justice or assistance. With patience, she learned how to read grain tallies, how to decipher a maester's quick figures, how to politely negotiate with merchants who arrived from White Harbor. She even accompanied Maester Luwin on small tours of the nearby villages, where she spoke softly with mothers and farmers, gleaning an understanding of what it meant to be responsible for others' lives. Robb sometimes watched her with amazement. While he had always been groomed to lead soldiers, to maintain the honor of House Stark, Shireen's sense of compassion and empathy seemed to fill gaps he hadn't realized existed. Winterfell, once marred by the bloody presence of Theon Greyjoy's treachery, began to heal under this new queen's influence. She oversaw small improvements, repairs to the library tower, additional blankets for the poorest households, a distribution of salted fish to families struggling with the shortened harvests. Over time, the castle folk and the small folk of the region began to speak of her with quiet admiration. "Our queen has a soft voice and a kind heart," some would say. "She might be scarred by grayscale, but it's her soul that matters." Shireen, bashful about such praise, simply continued her work. She felt a renewed sense of purpose each day, buoyed by the knowledge that she was contributing more than just a political link. Amid this flurry of responsibilities, Robb and Shireen's marriage thrived in its own gentle way. Their shared tasks and occasional private walks kept them close. When Robb rode out with his bannermen to quell a raid or to inspect a strongpoint, he returned weary, the weight of death in his eyes. Shireen would greet him at the gates, a quiet pillar of support. He began sharing more of his burdens, and in return, she opened up about her childhood fears, her loneliness in Dragonstone's harsh halls, her desire to be truly seen and valued. Sometimes, late at night, they would lie awake, listening to the howling winter winds, talking in hushed voices about the realm they wanted to build. A place where honor might guide decisions more than ambition, where the small folk need not fear the crush of war. Those moments knitted them closer than any vow uttered before a septon or a weirwood could have. Yet war did not relent. Eventually, news arrived of a resounding defeat suffered by Stannis in the southern marches, an ambush orchestrated by Lannister forces, rumored to have been reinforced by cunning Tyrell strategy. Robb received dire tidings as well. The Ironborn, under the vile leadership of Ramsay Snow, bastard of Roose Bolton, were sowing fresh terror along the eastern coast. The Boltons were an old and uneasy ally of the Starks, and Roose Bolton's allegiances were never simple. Whispers suggested that the Dreadfort harbored secrets that could threaten the fragile alliance of northern lords. Tensions ran high. Robb assembled his war council in the Great Hall. Lords from Carhold to Deepwood Motte gathered around heavy oaken tables. Shireen watched from her seat at Robb's left, her face grave as she listened to the strategies. The council debated marching west, marching east, forging or breaking alliances. Every suggestion reeked of bloodshed. Amid these grim counsels, Shireen found her voice. She reminded them of the cost to the people. She urged them to consider forging and negotiation with certain Ironborn captains, those who might be swayed by coin or promised pardons. She cautioned that a direct assault might leave whole villages ravaged. Some lords bristled at her pacifistic tone, but others acknowledged the practicality of not fighting a war on too many fronts. Robb listened, weighing her words. He would not yield to Ironborn tyranny, nor could he ignore the Boltons' ambiguous loyalties. But Shireen's counsel about limiting the damage, about preserving resources, rang true in a realm already bled dry by war. Ultimately, Robb dispatched an emissary to some of the smaller Ironborn crews, offering terms in exchange for withdrawing from the northern coasts. He simultaneously prepared his men to ride east if those negotiations failed. It was a delicate balance, one that required cunning. Shireen's input, rooted in empathy, had found a place among the iron-laced strategies of war. While many were uncertain, the seeds of her influence were sown. And though the times were perilous, she could not help but feel a measure of pride that she had contributed something tangible. One dusk, as Robb stood on the battlements with Shireen, the two of them overlooking the quiet expanse of the courtyard, he turned to her. "We are forging something new here," he said softly. "The North, the Stormlands, a different kind of realm. I never expected it to be so, I was so certain that vengeance, that reclaiming the North's honor, was all I could seek. Yet now I see how much more there is to protect. Shireen looked up at him, the chill wind brushing her cheeks. She understood his meaning. Before their marriage, Robb's world had been shaped by battle lines and sworn oaths of revenge. Now, gradually, he was trying to balance warfare with governance, forging alliances with compassion as well as steel. "My father believes in duty," she said in her soft, steady voice. It was all I ever saw in him, duty as a rigid chain, binding him to fight for the throne he says is rightfully his. But sometimes I wonder if there's another way. A path where duty and mercy are joined. Robb nodded, wrapping an arm around her. They stood in silence, letting the gloom of twilight envelop them. Somewhere in the distance, Grey Wind's soft growl punctured the hush, reminding them that danger was never far. It was not long after that the first fruits of their alliance began to manifest. Stormlander knights, though few in number, arrived at White Harbor to support the North in its conflicts against the Ironborn. Northern envoys managed to open new trade routes with smaller ports in the Stormlands, allowing for vital supplies to flow. There were no grand sweeping victories, but small steps toward stability. Neither the Lannisters nor the Tyrells approved of the strengthening bond, but they were too embroiled in King's Landing politics to mount an immediate offensive. Word reached Winterfell that Joffrey's court was in disarray, lurching from one scandal to another. The Tyrells secured their position by marrying Margaery to King Joffrey. And through it all, the Ravens carried updates of battles lost or won by the Baratheon forces, of shifting alliances that threatened to upend any notion of peace. Shireen found herself sorely missing her father despite her fear of disappointing him. She penned him letters detailing her life in Winterfell, the steps she was taking as queen, the closeness she felt with Robb. She hoped Stannis might be proud, but his replies were terse, cold, reminiscent of the man she had always known. He commended her service to the realm, reminded her that their enemies were many, and enjoined her to keep the North loyal should he press further claims. It broke her heart a little, but she poured her sorrow into more determined efforts to help Robb and to nurture the trust of the people around her. She refused to let the old gloom of Dragonstone sink back into her spirit. Occasionally, she would question Robb about whether he still felt the bitterness of losing the chance to marry for love. He would meet her gaze solemnly, brushing back a stray lock of her brown hair, letting his fingers linger near the grayscale mark on her cheek. "The war took many things from me, Shireen," he would say. "But in this union, I feel I've found someone worth more than a simple notion of romantic fancy. We share duty, yes, but we also share a bond that grows each day. I wouldn't trade that." And in those private, unguarded moments, she believed him. It was as though each confession knit them closer, forging a deeper trust. Their marriage was no grand passion from the tales of old, but it was anchored in sincerity, mutual respect, and a gentle affection that blossomed in the cracks of war. Time inched forward, measured by the shifting of the seasons and the relentless demands of war. In Winterfell, the storerooms needed to be stocked for the coming winter, for rumor had it that the cold would be fierce this year. The roads required patrols. The lords needed counsel. Shireen found herself growing more confident, more adept at navigating the labyrinth of governance. She still felt a pang whenever someone stared too long at her scars, but she bore it with grace, reminding herself that her scars did not define her. The realm, too, was scarred, and yet it persisted. It was late one afternoon, as the leaves in the godwood began turning a mottled gold and red, that Shireen made a small discovery. She was walking alone near the library tower, her mind swimming with thoughts of the latest raven from her father, news of a minor triumph in the Stormlands, when she overheard hushed voices. She recognized Lord Bolton's softness, speaking to a man she did not know. Something about divided loyalties and a necessary betrayal. Shireen's heart pounded. She quickly stepped behind a pillar, straining to catch more of the conversation. Bolton spoke of the flayed man's banner and of positioning troops near Moat Cailin under pretense of supporting the king. Her blood ran cold as she gleaned an implication of treachery. The words were vague, but their tone was unmistakable. The conversation ended abruptly, and she only caught fragments. "Soon enough, he suspects nothing." When the footsteps faded, Shireen emerged from her hiding spot, trembling. She had heard enough to suspect that Roose Bolton or his men were plotting something dire. Perhaps they were maneuvering to betray Robb Stark to the Lannisters or to claim the North for themselves. She felt a surge of fear. She had never been one for confrontations, never eager for danger. But she was queen now. Winterfell was her home, and Robb was her husband. She would not stand idly by while a serpent coiled in their midst. She rushed to find Robb only to discover he was in a war council with the Great Jon, the Karstarks, and other prominent lords. She hesitated at the door. She did not usually burst into councils unbidden, but the fear and urgency overcame her. She entered, cheeks flushed, her eyes shining with alarm. All heads turned. She nearly faltered at the weight of their collective gaze, but then she locked eyes with Robb, finding her courage. In halting words, she relayed what she had overheard. A murmur of disquiet rippled through the assembled lords. Some looked skeptical. Lord Bolton was a valuable if unsettling ally. Others looked angry. Robb's expression darkened. He took her aside to a quieter corner, pressing her for every detail. Shireen tried to recall the exact words, though her mind was a tumult of dread. She admitted she could not be certain of Bolton's precise plan, only that it smelled of betrayal. Robb cursed under his breath, recalling his mother's warnings about trusting the Dread Fort. The council debated fiercely. Some demanded Bolton be arrested outright, others insisted on caution, for a wrong move could rupture the alliance with the Dread Fort and spark civil war in the north. Robb stood at the center of the storm of opinions, trying to decide. Shireen pleaded that he be cautious but swift. "We cannot wait for them to strike," she said in a hushed voice, her hand trembling in his. "If Bolton is conspiring with the Lannisters or planning some form of treachery, it could doom us all." In the end, Robb ordered quiet surveillance of Roose Bolton and his men. He entrusted this task to a few loyal lords and the Great Jon, who was known for his blunt loyalty. No open accusations were made. Bolton, oblivious to the suspicion, continued to attend councils, wearing his trademark blank expression. Shireen, meanwhile, felt a simmering anxiety each time she saw him around the castle. She wondered if he sensed her fear, if he suspected she had overheard that conversation. She kept her head down, tried to preserve an air of normalcy, but inside she warred with panic. Days stretched into weeks. The Watchers reported small but troubling signs, Bolton's messengers leaving at odd hours, coded letters that they could not decipher, a steady drift of Bolton's men from certain outposts. Robb made no open move, waiting for a conclusive piece of evidence. Shireen began to lose sleep, haunted by the idea that each day brought them closer to a dagger in the dark. Robb sensed her tension and tried to reassure her, but the burden of leading a kingdom during wartime left him little time for soothing words. He appreciated her role in unmasking this potential threat, yet the danger of it weighed heavily on them both. Then, on a cold morning when the sun barely broke the horizon, the trap was laid bare. A small group of Bolton's men, escorted by a handful of Lannister riders, was intercepted near the neck. They carried a sealed agreement detailing terms for betraying the king in the north, promises of gold, titles, and dominion over certain territories once Robb Stark was brought down. The couriers were taken, the letter seized. The northern lords erupted in fury. Robb's face was grim as he read the contents of that parchment. Proof. Bolton was playing a dangerous game, presumably waiting for the perfect moment to strike at Robb's back, likely delivering him to the Lannisters in exchange for power. The council convened in an uproar. Accusations flew. Many demanded Bolton's immediate execution. Others counseled caution, as Bolton had many men under his command. A civil conflict in the north could weaken them all. Shireen stood near Robb, her stomach twisted in knots, uncertain how far this betrayal reached. But in the next breath, Roose Bolton arrived in the great hall, as though summoned by the dire tension in the air. He came quietly, his pale eyes flicking over the assembled lords, lingering for a moment on Shireen. Something about that look sent a chill through her bones. He spoke in his measured, rasping tone, asking if he was to be included in this council. Robb stood, the dam of his contained rage snapping. He confronted Bolton with the evidence, brandishing the intercepted letter. Gasps echoed through the hall. Bolton's face remained expressionless, but a faint twist in his lips betrayed him. He attempted to spin a narrative, claiming it was a ruse to entrap the Lannisters, that the letter had been forged. But the men captured with the letter had confessed under interrogation, naming him as their commander. Bolton's eyes flickered, recognizing there was no escape. Realizing the noose had tightened. The tension in the hall was suffocating as guards reached for their blades. In that fateful moment, Bolton made his move. He lunged for Robb, his dagger gleaming. The hall erupted into shouts. Men drew swords. Shireen was shoved back by the press of bodies, her scream lost in the chaos. Robb narrowly twisted aside, the dagger slicing the air near his ribs. A cluster of northern lords rushed to defend him, steel clashing on steel. Bolton fought with chilling calm, weaving through the chaos, taking down two men with startling efficiency. Blood slicked the floor. Shireen's heart pounded as she saw the deadly swirl of combat. She feared for Robb's life. At last, as Bolton prepared another strike, Robb's sword found an opening, piercing his chest. A hush fell. Bolton's eyes went wide, and a thin trickle of blood dripped from his pale lips. He slumped to his knees, his dagger clattering to the floor. The great hall was a tableau of violence, with lords and guards panting, the corpses of Bolton's loyal men littering the stone. Robb tore his sword free, his expression locked in fury and grief. Bolton managed a final, rattling whisper, something like a curse or a dark laugh, before collapsing, lifeless. In the aftermath, the dread truth of Bolton's betrayal spread like wildfire. Some of his loyal forces within the castle either attempted to flee or threw down their arms, terrified. Others were quickly seized. Robb ordered them imprisoned or executed according to the severity of their crimes. Word was sent across the north commanding Bolton's garrisons to stand down or face the wrath of a unified north. It was a precarious situation. Bolton's death might trigger further skirmishes. But for the moment, Winterfell was secure. Shireen spent that night trembling in Robb's arms, the scent of blood still lingering in her nostrils. She had grown in courage, yes, but the raw brutality of the betrayal shook her deeply. Robb held her close, murmuring soft reassurances. The next day, the castle tried to return to some sense of normalcy. The banners of House Bolton were torn down. The Drefort itself would need to be addressed, but for now, the immediate threat was crushed. And Shireen found some fragile peace in knowing that her discovery had helped protect Robb, protect the North. The incident, however, cast a long shadow. It reminded everyone that the War of the Five Kings had devolved into a cutthroat game of shifting allegiances. No place was truly safe. Robb grew more serious, more stern, as though each betrayal carved away a piece of his idealism. Shireen noticed the weight in his eyes. He had been forced to kill a man who, though unsettling, was a sworn bannerman. Now the war was not just with the Lannisters or the Ironborn, but the potential traitors within their own ranks. Shireen doubled her efforts to maintain stability within Winterfell, ensuring people remained loyal to their king. She sensed a new respect in the way the lords and ladies regarded her. She had played a part in exposing the plot, proving that kindness was not synonymous with weakness. Amid the gloom, a beacon of hope arrived in a message from Dragonstone. Stannis had scored a minor victory in the Stormlands, capturing a key fortress held by a Lannister bannerman. He wrote that he intended to press the advantage, forcing the Lannisters to divert troops away from the north if they hoped to keep the crown secure. Though his letter remained formal, he acknowledged Shireen's role in advising Robb. "It seems you have grown into your responsibilities," he wrote. "My blood runs in your veins. Remember your duty." Shireen read and reread that line, feeling the faintest stirring of satisfaction. Her father might not be openly proud, but he recognized her contribution. Perhaps that was the closest to praise he could manage. As the realm continued its slow bleed, as rival kings rose and fell, the alliance between the North and the Stormlands held. Word spread of the young queen in the North, a Baratheon girl with the strength of a stag and the unyielding loyalty of a direwolf. Some scoffed. Others saw it as a symbol, a new generation forging bonds that transcended old boundaries. In hushed corridors and on muddy battlefields, the name Shireen Stark Baratheon took root, representing a softer path amid the carnage, yet one backed by iron resolve. The months that followed tested that resolve further. The Lannisters sent envoys bearing false promises of peace. The Ironborn tested the shores again. But each threat was met with a unified front, bolstered by the knowledge that the North was not alone, that Storm's End would also stand if needed. Shireen continued her quiet governance, acting as a voice for those who would otherwise be voiceless. Robb pressed on with his campaign, carefully choosing battles and forging alliances with houses that saw beyond petty crowns to the greater danger of unending war. Together, they navigated the storms of blood and steel. As the leaves fell and winter threatened to descend in earnest, Winterfell braced for the season of snows. The gates closed earlier in the evenings, the storehouses were carefully tallied. In the tower room that was once lonely and cold, Shireen lit a small fire each night, waiting for Robb's return from his war councils. Occasionally, she would brush her fingers across her scarred cheek, recalling the child she had been, trapped in Dragonstone's shadows, certain no one would ever truly see her. Now, with each passing day, she felt something new taking shape, a future defined by unity, compassion, and the slow forging of trust among lords and knights who once would have dismissed her out of hand. She would never forget that the realm was fraught with danger. She knew the White Walkers were more than mere whispers, though no one could confirm the extent of the threat beyond the wall. She knew that the Lannisters still clung to King's Landing like a wounded beast, and that her father, Stannis, would never halt his relentless campaign until the Iron Throne was his or he was dead. But she also knew that in Winterfell's ancient halls a new bond had been forged, one made as much of respect and care as political necessity. When Robb took her hand, she felt the warmth of hope, a belief that the North, guided by both the old gods and the new, could stand firm against the trials to come. In time, bards might sing of this union, of the gentle queen who braved winter's cold with a quiet steel, and the wolf king who opened his heart to a frail-looking girl whose spirit proved unbreakable. They might not sing of the sleepless nights, the anxious tears, or the whispered confessions in the dark. But those intimate moments formed the bedrock of their alliance, an anchor for an age battered by storms. And in each other's eyes, Robb and Shireen found the resolve to endure, to shape a destiny that might, just might, offer a gentler future for the North and the Stormlands alike. Even when ravens brought dire tidings, even when enemies threatened their gates, the unshakable pact between House Stark and House Baratheon remained. The quiet presence of Shireen, with her scarred cheek and her unwavering heart, counterbalanced the thunderous leadership of Robb, whose sword arm and sense of honor compelled legions to follow him. Through heartbreak and conflict, they stood side by side, forging a story that defied the bitterness of war. In the end, perhaps that was all one could hope for. A measure of mercy in a land starved of it, nurtured by a bond that neither storms nor winter winds could tear asunder. Winter in the North had long been heralded as a slow, creeping hand of ice that covered the land, but never before had the people of Winterfell felt it looming so near and so implacable. Despite all the realms' wars, despite the Lannisters and Tyrells maneuvering in the south, despite the Ironborn's predations, something older and more chilling gathered beyond the wall. Word came from the Night's Watch, fragmented reports of movements in the far north, rumors of whites and an unearthly foe beyond mortal comprehension. Ravens arrived bearing pleas for aid, urging the great lords of Westeros to send men, food, or at least acknowledgement of this growing menace. But the lords of the realm were consumed by other worries. The Iron Throne was still contested, houses still betrayed each other for gold or personal advancement, and the War of the Five Kings had sown chaos that no single crow's message could fully dispel. At Winterfell, the name White Walkers was spoken with uneasy glances. Some believed only half the tales, old granny's stories to frighten children. Others, like old Nan once had, believed fully in those ancient horrors. Still others whispered that if any threat truly stirred, it would be the Night's Watch's duty to handle it, as it had in centuries past. But Robb Stark did not dismiss the possibility of danger. Shireen listened in on the war councils where her husband weighed each threat, the Lannisters to the south, the Ironborn to the east and west coasts, Frey unrest near the Twins, and now the ominous tidings from beyond the wall. The north was vast, and Robb had lost too many good men already in the swirl of conflict. If the Night's Watch proved correct, this new foe would care little for crowns or banners. For her part, Shireen had been delving deeper into Winterfell's archives. She'd begun this habit not long after unmasking Bolton's treachery, feeling more than ever that knowledge was armor. Down winding corridors lit by torches that flickered against the old stone, she discovered a locked section of the library. With Maester Luwin's permission, she gained access to treatises and records that had not been read in generations, some older than Aegon's conquest, others a chaotic mixture of genealogies and legends. There she found references to the Long Night, hints of ancient battles waged against the others. She read of heroes who held the darkness at bay, of the children of the forest, of the founding of the Night's Watch. Lore swirled in her mind, half of it contradictory or obscured by time, but one fact remained unchanging. Something once threatened the realm from the far north, and the living only survived through unity and sacrifice. She took her findings to Robb. One cold evening, by the light of a small fire crackling in the hearth of their chambers, she showed him old parchments describing the winter that lasted a generation, the others leading armies of the dead, the forging of the wall. Robb turned each page carefully, brow furrowed in thought. "My father believed in the stories," he said at last, gazing into the dancing flames. He spoke little of them, but he never mocked the Watch for their vigilance. He always said the wall stands as a warning as much as a defense. Shireen reached for his hand, recalling how Eddard Stark's reputation for honor had carried a sense of deep gravity. "If there's a threat, how do we convince the rest of Westeros to heed it? Even if we muster the North, we can't stand alone if these legends prove real." Robb shook his head. "I don't know. But first, we must secure our own borders. If the North is bleeding from within, we won't be able to spare a single man for the wall." Shireen understood. They had only just rooted out Roose Bolton's treachery, and though the dread fort was now in the hands of more loyal Stark men, the scars of betrayal lingered. Surviving Bolton men had fled, and no one could say for sure if they sought refuge with the Freys or with the Lannisters. Winterfell's position was strong, but the realm around them was still unstable. And winter marched closer every day, demanding that they fill granaries and slaughter herds at precisely the right time, that they see to the small folk who might starve if unprepared. Gradually, the North did begin to settle under Robb's leadership. Lord Karstark, despite his bitterness over certain past grievances, reaffirmed fealty, viewing the Boltons' downfall as a sign that Robb was not blindly trusting. The Manderleys of White Harbor began shipping in salted fish and other supplies, ensuring that Winterfell and neighboring regions would not starve. Relations with smaller houses like the Glovers and the Serwins grew steadier as each recognized that the king in the north was truly trying to protect them, not simply wage a war of vanity in the south. Shireen's presence, gentle, diligent, and disarmingly sincere, helped grease the wheels of these alliances. Lords who might have balked at taking orders from a young king they perceived as battle-hungry found their edges softened by Shireen's kindness and her willingness to work closely with the local stewards on practical matters. Robb often traveled across the north, overseeing defensive measures and ensuring bannermen remained loyal. Shireen occasionally accompanied him, riding with a modest retinue. It was a strange sight for many small folk, their young queen from the Stormlands, bundled in thick furs, her cheeks pink from the biting cold, greeting them with soft-spoken questions about their crops and their children. In more populous towns, people bowed low and addressed her as Your Grace, but in remote villages, old crones with missing teeth simply gawked at her scarred face with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Yet Shireen smiled at them regardless, asked how they kept warm, whether they needed additional grain or cloth. Most found themselves warming to her, if for no other reason than that a queen had bothered to inquire after their lives. In Robb's absence, Winterfell was left largely in her hands, with oversight from Catelyn Stark and Maester Luwin. Catelyn carried her own burdens. She missed her daughters desperately, Sansa, a captive in King's Landing, and Arya, whereabouts unknown. Rumors reached them sporadically, Sansa betrothed to King Joffrey, then that betrothal broken and replaced by another alliance with the Tyrells. Nobody seemed certain if Sansa was still in the capital or if she might have escaped. Shireen often found Catelyn praying in the Godwood, tears silently coursing down her cheeks, seeking some measure of solace. Yet Catelyn remained a source of invaluable counsel, guiding Shireen on how to handle crises and disputes when Robb rode elsewhere. The pair of them grew closer, bridging the gap between mother and daughter-in-law with a mutual desire to protect House Stark and all those sworn to it. That winter's official onset came with a blizzard so fierce that even the sturdiest men struggled to keep the gates and walls clear. Snow piled in drifts against the ramparts, and frost rimed the windows of every tower. Wolves howled in the distance at night, and even gray winds seemed unsettled by the cutting, frigid wind. Shireen found herself huddling near the hearths more often, a thick blanket over her shoulders, remembering the dank chill of Dragonstone's halls. But Winterfell, with its hot springs beneath the ground, never froze entirely. Warm currents circulated through the walls and floors, offering a modicum of comfort amid the howling storms. Despite the cold, the demands of leadership did not abate. On the second day of the blizzard, the Great John arrived from Last Hearth, stomping into the Great Hall, shaking snow from his cloak, and bellowing that a group of men claiming to be Night's Watch recruits had been found wandering near the Umber lands. Starving, frostbitten, they spoke of horrors beyond the wall. The Great John couldn't parse whether their tales were ravings of half-dead men or warnings that demanded action. Shireen listened gravely. She sent for Maester Luwin to see to the men's injuries, and she commissioned a small party to escort them to Winterfell for safety until Robb could return. When Robb did return a few days later, riding in through a swirl of snow and biting wind, Shireen ran to meet him in the courtyard. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and bits of ice clung to the fur collar of his cloak. She embraced him, ignoring the curious stares of guards and stable hands. His warmth against her was a sudden reminder that each time he left, she feared losing him in the chaos of war. He smiled, though lines of exhaustion marked his face, and asked about the men from the Umber lands. They spoke with these recruits in a small antechamber near the kitchens, where the heat of the ovens and roasting fires made the air thick with the smell of bread and spice. The men were in a sorry state. 2 or 3 were so frostbitten that they'd lost fingers, another was delirious from fever. But the one who could speak coherently introduced himself as Ross Art, once a Sellsword from the Westerlands, who claimed that after hearing of King Beyond the Wall Mance Raider's movements, he decided to join the Watch rather than starve. His words tumbled out in a frantic rush as he spoke of whites, dead men walking, ice-blue eyes, unstoppable. Most in the room exchanged wary glances, uncertain how much of it was an exaggeration. But Robb and Shireen, mindful of the ancient histories, found themselves believing at least a portion of his account. When pressed for more detail, Rossart could only talk about a night blacker than pitch, with screams echoing in the distance, and how the very cold seemed alive. In the nights that followed, Robb's sleep was troubled. Shireen would wake to him muttering in his fitful rest, sometimes lurching upright as though from a nightmare. When she asked, he admitted that the thought of some massive undead threat riding down from the far north felt more overwhelming than any Lannister army. Armies of men could be fought with steel and cunning and alliances. But legends come to life might demand a different kind of warfare. He also worried about Jon Snow, his half-brother at the Wall, though in truth Ned Stark had always treated Jon as one of his own. If Jon was still with the Watch, he might be directly in harm's way. Shireen, curling close, whispered reassurances that they would find a path. Still, an undercurrent of dread settled over Winterfell. Meanwhile, the war took on new dimensions. A raven arrived from River on serious news. Edmure Tully wrote that Walder Frey was making fresh demands, incensed that Robb had broken his earlier promise to wed a Frey daughter. That promise had been rendered moot by the Baratheon alliance, but Walder Frey was not the sort of man to forgive easily. The letter spoke of tension around the twins, of Freymen blocking key passages for caravans carrying supplies from the Riverlands to the north. They were not seizing goods outright, but they were delaying, searching thoroughly, imposing fees, undermining the crucial route. Edmure urged Robb to find a resolution. Winter was here, and the North's supply lines could ill afford disruption. Robb assembled his council in the great hall, the tall windows laden with frost, the fire roaring in the massive hearth. Lords and knights bristled at any notion of appeasing Walder Frey. The memory of that old man's sleight and cunning was fresh in their minds. Yet to open another front of conflict, particularly if the Freys sought alliances with the Lannisters, would be disastrous. Catelyn quietly offered advice, reminding them that the Freys' pride had been wounded and that Walder Frey was the sort to nurse a grudge unless soothed by new gifts or promises. Some suggested a betrothal for a younger Stark sibling or cousin to repair the slight. But the only possible candidate of note among the immediate Starks was Rickon, still a child. Catelyn grew pale at the idea of sending her youngest to the twins, and Robb dismissed the notion outright. Perhaps there is another path, Shireen ventured gently. All eyes turned toward her. Even the great Jon quieted, though he was no great friend of diplomacy. A royal pardon or a boon. Walder Frey might accept a gesture that reaffirms his importance to our kingdom. Or he might be open to a trade of hostages to ensure good faith. If we cannot offer a Stark, then perhaps we can offer closer ties, trade incentives, an official seat on our war councils. She paused, picking her words carefully. I know the Freys are prickly about their lineage. Perhaps we can legitimize some part of it in the eyes of the realm, or name them keepers of the crossing for the North Stormlands Alliance. Something that flatters Walder Frey's sense of self-importance. A thoughtful silence fell. Catelyn studied her daughter-in-law, looking as though she recognized something of Sansa's more diplomatic approach shining through. But Sansa had always been trained in the art of courtesy, while Shireen came by her gentleness almost by necessity. Robb nodded slowly. Walder Frey is not a man of unwavering honor. But he does respond to advantage. If we can make him think he gains more from friendship than enmity, perhaps we avoid more bloodshed. No immediate decision was reached, but Shireen's suggestion lingered. Over the next few days, letters were drafted by Catelyn and Robb, careful, measured, offering the Freys official recognition of their control over the twins within the North Sphere, as well as a place at any major negotiations between Winterfell, Dragonstone, and other realms should Stannis press his claims. It was a calculated risk, but if Walder Frey remained sullen and uncooperative, a devastating conflict could arise in the Riverlands. Amid these entanglements, another raven arrived from Dragonstone. It bore a short, blunt message. Stannis Baratheon intended to march on King's Landing come spring if the snows receded enough to allow troop movements. He desired that Robb provide at least partial support, perhaps a flanking maneuver to draw the Lannister armies away from the city. Stannis couched this in the language of rightful duty that as his son-in-law, Robb was now bound to uphold the Baratheon claim to the Iron Throne. Shireen read the letter with an odd sense of detachment. She respected her father, but she'd become accustomed to the North's viewpoint. They had declared their independence, intending no king save the king in the North. The alliance with House Baratheon was meant to safeguard both parties, not necessarily to place Stannis upon the Iron Throne with Stark steel. When Robb finished reading, he set the letter down, a crease between his brows. He calls me to serve as though I owe him fealty. Yet we have never bent the knee to him, nor do we intend to. Our marriage was a pact, not a submission. Shireen nodded, recalling the terms: each side would protect the other, would remain at peace, would offer mutual assistance against the Lannisters, but the North's independence was non-negotiable. Stannis' ambitions had not faded, though. Father sees no difference between an alliance and loyalty, she said softly. I doubt he means offense. He simply does not think in subtleties. If it furthers his cause, he believes we should commit. Robb exhaled. I will not march our men to King's Landing in the midst of winter. It's suicide. The roads are impassable, supplies scarce. The Lannisters would cut us down long before we reached the capital. We need to focus on defending our borders, possibly sending some aid to the Watch. I cannot commit to an offensive hundreds of leagues away. Not now. He penned a reply, polite yet firm, explaining the North's stance, promising to consider future collaborations but refusing any immediate deployment. Shireen added a postscript in her own hand, expressing hope for her father's health and success but urging caution. She sealed it with the dire wolf and stag sigils intertwined, hoping it might soften her father's reaction. Each day, the cold deepened. Icicles hung from every tower, some as long as a man's arm. The courtyard became a maze of trampled snow turned to slick ice beneath the boots of guardsmen. Hunting parties ventured out less frequently, returning with fewer kills. Occasionally, a small group of hungry refugees arrived, displaced from distant villages where the harvest had failed or where bandits roamed. Winterfell took them in as best it could, but the strain showed. Provisions dwindled faster than anticipated. Shireen and Maester Luwin spent long hours recalculating rationing schedules, worried about how dire the situation might become if the snows lingered until spring was lost. Amid these growing burdens, life carried on within the castle. Sometimes, late in the evening, after hours of tension, a subtle cheer would flicker to life in the great hall. Musicians would strike up a tune, servants would pour mulled wine, and the younger guards or stable hands might dance with laughter echoing off stone walls. Shireen often observed these moments from a bench near the high table, heartened by the resilience of the North's spirit. Occasionally, Robb would join her, and they might share a quiet dance, an escape from the grind of ruling. She treasured those dances, for in those moments, he was not a king weighed by war, and she was not a queen anxious about living up to her father's demands. They were just Robb and Shireen, two young people trying to carve out a bit of warmth in a frozen, uncertain world. But rarely did this peace last more than a night or two. A fresh crisis always emerged. One morning, Maester Luwin hurried into the great hall, breathless with urgency. A raven from Eastwatch by the sea, he announced. The Night's Watch claims they have spotted whites on the coasts, raiders or dead things attacking fishing villages. The wildlings are also on the move. It seems Mance Raiders' forces are crossing the frozen seas, seeking a way around the wall. A hush fell. Robb read the message, then handed it to Shireen. The words were grim. The Watch was outnumbered and had no choice but to retreat in some areas. Several smaller keeps along the wall had been abandoned. Eastwatch called upon any who could help. The note ended with a desperate plea. If the realm does not unite, the living will be devoured by the dead. Robb crumpled the parchment slightly in his fist. This is what we feared. The threat is real and we are the closest to it. We can't ignore this. Some of the lords murmured uneasy agreement. Others quietly expressed that they had never sworn to defend the wall. The Night's Watch was supposed to handle threats beyond the border. But Shireen gazed around at the worried faces and felt a tightness in her chest. If we let them fall, what then? The White Walkers, if they are real, won't stop at the wall. Robb's expression hardened. We'll have to spare what men and supplies we can, even if it weakens us elsewhere. The realm is burning itself in petty wars while an older menace stirs. At once, protests rose. If they sent men north, the Lannisters might take advantage in the south. If they diverted food to the Watch, their own people might starve. Voices overlapped in the great hall. Tension coiled. Shireen placed a hand on Robb's arm, a reminder to hold his temper. She understood the Lord's fears. Every inch of resources was precious in winter, but ignoring the Watch would be a gamble that could cost them all. Robb finally silenced the clamor by raising his voice. We are the North. The wall was built by our forefathers to protect these lands. That protection falls to us as well. Whether the rest of the realm follows or not is their choice, but I will not have it said that House Stark abandoned the Watch in their hour of need. A compromise was reached after hours of debate. A moderate contingent, 500 men, supplies enough to last a few months, would be sent to Castle Black under the command of Galbart Glover, a seasoned soldier. If more forces were required, the North would send them if feasible. Maester Luwin would dispatch ravens urging other northern houses to do the same. Shireen sat through this council, quiet but fiercely supportive, grateful that Robb would not let the Watch fight alone. Privately, she only worried that her father and the other kings and lords in the south would not see reason until it was too late. As the dispatch was prepared, tensions remained around the twins. A response finally arrived from Walder Frey filled with petty slights, but also grudging acceptance of some of the offered terms. He demanded to be styled Warden of the Crossing, though the North traditionally bestowed no such title. Still, Robb and Catelyn judged it a lesser concession than war. They debated whether to invite a Frey delegation to Winterfell or to send a formal northern envoy to the twins for a face-to-face negotiation. In the end, it was decided that Catelyn herself, along with a few key advisors, would ride to the twins to finalize the arrangement. This was done carefully, well-guarded, mindful that Walder Frey was no friend. Shireen wanted to accompany her, but Robb insisted she remain in Winterfell. The roads were treacherous with snow and ice, and it was too dangerous a journey for the Queen, while he himself was prepared to ride out to address other looming threats. Shireen acquiesced, though she felt a tug of guilt at sending her good mother alone. Robb rode west soon after to Moat Cailin, accompanied by a party of key lords, intending to inspect fortifications and assess any further threats from the Ironborn. Before he departed, he took Shireen's hands in his own in the courtyard, their breath mingling in the cold air. "I'll return as soon as I can," he promised. "Keep Winterfell safe. If you need counsel, rely on Maester Luwin and the Great John if you must, though he might be half-mad with the winter storms." She tried to smile, but the memory of all the times he'd ridden away and the knowledge that each ride could be his last brought moisture to her eyes. "Come back in one piece. This realm grows colder each day without you here." He leaned his forehead against hers, ignoring the watchers on the battlements. "I'll come back," he murmured. "We have too much at stake. Too many battles yet to fight together." Then he mounted his horse, gray wind padding by his side, and the northern gates yawned open to release them into the swirling snow. Shireen stood on the ramparts, her furs wrapped tightly around her, watching his figure disappear into the white haze. Only when she could see him no longer did she turn away, swallowing the dread that always threatened to choke her whenever they parted. Days became weeks, and she governed as best she could. The men bound for the Wall departed, trudging north along the King's Road. She checked on them before they left, ensuring they had warm cloaks and hearty rations. Her interactions with the local people continued. She sorted petty disputes, addressed concerns of raiding wolves in the outer farms, arranged for the orphans of a bandit attack to be housed within the castle. Some days were quiet, with the hush of snowfall blanketing Winterfell, and she could almost pretend there was peace in the realm. On other days, men would rush in with fresh reports of undead sightings near the Wall, or of Lannister outriders near the Trident. The precarious balance of events made it difficult to sleep soundly. To distract herself, Shireen spent more time in the Godwood, finding the Weirwood's presence oddly comforting despite the old gods being unfamiliar to her. She knelt beneath the bone-white trunk, the carved face weeping red sap, and let her thoughts wander. Sometimes she prayed in the manner the Septas had taught her, reciting the names of the seven, but mostly she simply breathed in the cold air, letting the hush of the ancient grove soothe her nerves. She thought of her father, of Robb, of King's Landing, of the threat beyond the Wall. In her mind, these all blended together, pieces of a puzzle that might never be fully assembled. She discovered that the small council Robb had left behind relied on her more each day. The steward needed her signature on new rationing orders. The Master-at-Arms asked her approval to train recruits in advanced tactics. Maester Luwin sought her permission to send ravens encouraging other houses to consider the Watch's plight more seriously. At first, she felt overwhelmed. She was not used to wielding such authority without Robb or Catelyn present. But she recalled the months spent learning Winterfell's administration, her father's lessons in duty, and, above all, the empathy she had nurtured from an early age. Gradually, she found a confident rhythm in responding to the demands. She was not naive enough to believe she had all the answers, but she took counsel from the wise heads around her and made decisions that balanced practicality with kindness. Some of the older, more traditional Northerners watched this with a mix of curiosity and growing respect. They saw the once timid Baratheon girl calmly issuing directives, ensuring no one in the castle starved, mediating a dispute between a visiting trader and the local blacksmith, even seeing to the reading of new laws that Robb had drafted. Whispers emerged in the courtyard about how she might yet be a true northern queen, a queen who listened, who understood. A few men still murmured that Robb Stark should have married a northern maid, but fewer voices championed that view with each passing day. Late one night, when Shireen was drifting to a restless sleep, a pounding came at her chamber door. She jolted awake, heart hammering. A guard's voice called urgently. She threw on a cloak over her nightgown and opened the door. The guard stammered, "A raven, your grace, from Dragonstone. It bears Stannis Baratheon's seal, and it's marked urgent." Sleep fled her eyes. She stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, taking the scroll from the guard's trembling hands. By flickering torchlight, she read her father's words. His letter was short, the script blotched with what looked like a shaking quill. "Shireen, we march upon King's Landing before the next moon's turn. Storm's End is secured, the Stormlords rally. I have Melisandre's council fire will guide us to victory. I require you to dispatch any loyal Stormlander knights still with you and any further support the North can spare. Cersei and her bastard children must fall. We cannot allow the Iron Throne to remain in false hands. Do your duty as my daughter? Stand with me. In the light of the Lord of Light I serve. Stannis Baratheon." She felt a queasy pit in her stomach. Melisandre, that red priestess who had come to Dragonstone, who spoke of a foreign god of fire and shadows. Shireen had never understood the hold Melisandre had over her father, but she sensed it was powerful. She also recognized that Stannis's demand for more men was tantamount to ignoring everything else the North faced. Did he truly not grasp the severity of the threat beyond the wall, or did he simply not care if it did not directly affect his campaign? She spent a sleepless night pacing her chambers. She weighed the possible responses. If Robb were here, he would not send men to King's Landing, not in the dead of winter, and especially not when he had just committed a force to support the Watch. Beyond that, mobilizing more troops would leave the North vulnerable. Yet refusing Stannis outright might shatter the alliance that had lent a certain stability. Shireen felt torn between her father's blunt directive and the reality she saw with her own eyes. By morning, she summoned the small council. She read them the letter. A tense debate followed. Most were inclined to refuse. "We cannot march south," declared the Master-at-Arms. "It would be madness, especially not now." The Great John barked that the real war was in the north, not the south. Maester Luwin gently pointed out that if Stannis felt ignored, he might withdraw vital Stormland's support, possibly opening the door for the Lannisters to isolate the north again. And so they argued in circles. In the end, Shireen decided to draft a careful reply, stating that the North's men were engaged in defending the realm from grave dangers, that winter precluded a southern march, and that any Stormlander knights present in the north were free to join Stannis of their own will but would not be ordered away from the war councils to which they had pledged themselves. She signed and sealed it heart-heavy, knowing her father would take offense. Yet she had come to respect the responsibilities the north faced. This was her home now, just as much as Dragonstone once was. She prayed quietly that Stannis would see reason, or at least not turn his anger upon her. That night, she dreamt of storms, of fiery shadows flickering on castle walls, of her father's stern face telling her she had failed him. She awoke in a cold sweat, wishing she could confide in Robb. A week later, still with no word from Robb, another letter arrived, this time from the south. Ser Davos Seaworth had written, somehow finding time amid Stannis's campaign. The letter was personal in tone, addressing Shireen respectfully as Your Grace and explaining that Stannis was resolute in attacking King's Landing and that Melisandre foretold victory if the realm recognized Stannis as Azor Ahai reborn. Whatever that meant. Davos was more subdued, suggesting that this war might be longer and bloodier than anticipated and that Stannis's unwavering nature could lead him to extremes. He closed by saying he hoped she would remain safe in the north, that he still remembered her childhood kindness on Dragonstone, and that if the tides of battle shifted, he would send further word. Reading Davos's letter brought tears to Shireen's eyes, for the Onion Knight had always been a gentle presence, one of the few in Dragonstone who treated her with warmth. She prayed for his safety. At last, Robb returned to Winterfell just as the snows began to relent, bearing news both heartening and worrying. He had shored up Moat Cailin's defenses, forcing the Ironborn to retreat from the Neck. Along the way, he had received disturbing reports of restless spirits, peasants' tales of pale shapes that drifted through the trees at night. Robb had dismissed some of it as rumor, but each day he became more certain that something unnatural stalked the edges of the realm. He also brought back tidings that Catelyn had reached the twins safely, though Walder Frey continued to haggle for more concessions. At Loo Ast no blood had been spilled there. Exhausted, Robb joined Shireen in their chambers, listening as she recounted Stannis's demands. He grew tense, pacing near the window that overlooked the snowy courtyard. "I cannot spare men for his war, no matter how he phrases it," Robb said. "If he storms King's Landing, he storms it alone. The North cannot bleed more than it already has. My father always taught me that a true king protects his own. Marching men south to die in a siege we may not even win, that's not protecting the North." Shireen worried her lower lip. "He won't take it well." "He rarely does." Robb paused to touch her hand. "I'm sorry. I know he's your father." She looked away, recalling Stannis's stern face, that sense of quiet longing she'd felt all her childhood for some spark of warmth from him. "Yes, but you're my husband. I trust your judgment. And after everything I've seen, I believe father might be chasing something that will cost us more than we can afford." They resolved to maintain the current stance. No northern troops would march south under the present conditions. If Stannis took the capital, then negotiations would follow to recognize the North's independence. If he failed, well, the conflict would continue to churn on. A fragile sense of equilibrium returned to Winterfell, overshadowed by rumors of the unnatural. Then came a letter from Castle Black. It was penned in a firm, bold hand that made Robb's throat catch. Jon Snow had written to his brother, warning him that Mance Rayder's army numbered in the thousands, that White Walkers and Whites were very real, and that the Watch was in desperate need of every bit of aid the realm could muster. Shireen read it over Robb's shoulder, seeing the raw urgency in Jon's words. He described an attack in the night, corpses reanimated, men screaming as their own fallen comrades rose to kill them. He spoke of Samwell Tarly's improbable survival after slaying a White Walker with dragonglass and how that fabled substance might be the key to defeating them. Shireen shivered at the idea. Even reading the words on parchment felt like stepping into a nightmare. Robb swallowed hard. Jon was never one for tall tales. If he says the dead walk, then I believe him. Shireen could barely find her voice. "What do we do? The men we sent can't hold back an army of thousands alone." "We do more," Robb said, setting the letter aside. "We rally the North. This is no mere trickle of wildlings. It's the entire free folk fleeing a threat that outstrips them. And the Watch stands in the middle. If the Watch falls, Mance Rayder's forces will pour into our lands, followed by the Whites." Thus began a campaign unlike any the North had planned before. Robb convened an emergency gathering of lords in Winterfell's Great Hall. The banners of House Stark, House Glover, House Manderly, House Serwyn, House Umber, and more represented. He spoke plainly. The true war was here, and if they did not address the nightmare beyond the wall, the North would be ravaged. He urged each lord to muster a portion of men, to gather supplies, and to prepare for a march to the wall once the worst of the snows eased. He also mandated that blacksmiths begin forging arrowheads and spear points out of dragonglass if it could be found, or obsidian from any place they could unearth it, though that material was scarce in the North. Even ordinary steel might help hold a fortress, but if Jon's letters were accurate, special measures would be needed to kill White Walkers. Many lords responded with caution, reluctant to leave their lands in a time of winter. But the great Jon roared that he would stand with the king in the North. Manderly pledged soldiers, albeit fewer than in warmer times, but still a commitment. The northern houses, for all their differences, realized that if they did nothing, the realm they guarded would be lost anyway. None wanted to see the day when Whites marched through their farmlands, or White Walkers stalked the streets of White Harbor. Shireen watched from the dais, her heart pounding. It was an unprecedented move, pulling a significant force north instead of focusing on the Riverlands or the Lannisters. But something about it felt right, like finally acknowledging that the greatest danger was not the Iron Throne's occupant, but the unstoppable march of an ancient enemy. She thought of Stannis heading for King's Landing, likely oblivious to the rising darkness behind him. She could only hope that one day, the truths of this threat would reach the southern lords before it was too late. Over the next weeks, preparations commenced at a frantic pace. Young men were conscripted. Maesters scoured storerooms for any references to obsidian, any knowledge of the long night's battles. Ravens flew to every corner of the North, urging cooperation and caution. Robb himself rode to several key regions to spur the lords on. Shireen remained in Winterfell, coordinating the logistics, food, shelter, supplies for the thousands of men who would eventually converge at the castle before marching north. She found she was surprisingly adept at the details, reminiscent of the hours she'd spent in Dragonstone's dreary halls, learning to keep accounts and stock ledgers. She did not enjoy turning men into columns of figures, but she recognized the necessity. An army that starves is no army at all. As the freeze began to lighten, caravans started arriving at Winterfell. Wagons piled with salted fish, dried meats, hard breads. Men arrived in thick cloaks, bearing the sigils of Umber, Glover, Tallheart, Serwyn, Hornwood, Mormont, and more. Tents were pitched in every available courtyard and field. The tension was palpable. None knew exactly what they would face upon reaching the wall, only that the stories were grim. Shireen rode among them on occasion, accompanied by a few guards, addressing concerns, checking on wounded from the harsh journey. Though she was slight and still somewhat shy, the men recognized her as the queen who had helped hold the North together through one crisis after another. Many offered a quick bow or a polite nod, relieved to see a calm presence amid the swirling uncertainty. Some asked her about the Stormlands, or teased that she must think them half-savage. She smiled and told them gently that each region had its own hardships, but none so formidable as the winter they all now faced. Catelyn returned from the twins around this time, looking drained but alive. Walder Frey had, at length, accepted the concessions, a formal recognition of his dominion over the crossing and a seat on certain councils. He was not happy, but he was placated enough to keep the peace. Catelyn was glad to be free of the Frey's suspicious stares. She was dismayed, however, to learn that the North would now ride to the wall, for she feared it might draw Robb's focus away from retrieving her daughters. Robb explained that he had no choice. The Freys were a lesser worry compared to the wave of death that threatened them from the far north. Catelyn bowed her head, acknowledging he was right, though tears glistened in her eyes at the thought of Sansa and Arya still lost to her. As for Walder Frey, he might have made more demands had he known the bulk of the North's forces were about to leave for the wall. But the new treaty was in place, and with winter complicating travel, the Freys likely would not move until the thaw. By then, Robb hoped they would have pushed back whatever threatened the wall, or at least secured it enough to return and stand guard over the rest of the realm. And perhaps, in the best of outcomes, the South would awaken to the danger and join them in this new, necessary war. Finally, the day came when Robb could delay no longer. The snows had receded enough to make the King's Road passable, if still treacherous. Thousands of northern soldiers were assembled, lines of riders, wagons, footmen, even a few catapults dragged along for good measure. Robb donned his armor, the direwolf sigil shining on his breastplate, though the metal was scratched from past battles. Shireen saw the strain in his eyes. He was not sure how this war would be fought or won, only that it must be. Atop his horse, gray wind at his side, he turned to bid her farewell once more. But this time, she stepped forward, gloved hand gripping his stirrup, and announced that she would accompany him north. A ripple passed through the crowd. Robb's eyes widened. Shireen, it's no small journey, and what lies at the end is worse. She stood firm, her cheeks flushed from more than just the cold. I am queen to the north, and if our men are marching to stand against this threat, I will not hide behind Winterfell's walls while they face it. The lords will need unity and leadership, and so will the small folk we may meet on the road. My father taught me duty, and you have taught me courage. I would not forgive myself if I remained behind. Robb searched her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though worry etched his features. Then we ride together. They left a trusted castellan, along with a modest garrison, to keep Winterfell safe. Catelyn chose to remain as well, having only recently returned from the twins. She was torn, wanting to be with her son, but also wishing to safeguard the seat of House Stark. Shireen hugged her good mother farewell, and Catelyn whispered a quiet thanks for looking after Robb. Then the horns blew, echoing across the snowy courtyard, and the great host began its march. Shireen rode close to Robb, her cloak trimmed with fur to keep out the chill, a sturdy horse beneath her. She felt a strange mixture of fear and resolve. She had seen war scars, had witnessed betrayal and bloodshed, but never had she faced the unknown terror that lurked beyond the wall. The journey was arduous, even with the diminishing snows. Men slipped on icy roads, wagons broke down in rutted mud. Yet the force pressed on, day by day, inching north along the King's Road. Local villages watched in astonishment as the largest northern host in recent memory trudged by with stony determination. Occasionally, scouts reported bandits lurking in the woods, but most troublemakers fled at the sight of so many armed men. At night, the campfires stretched in clusters across fields or clearings, a tapestry of flickering light. Soldiers huddled around the flames, speaking in hushed voices about the White Walkers. Some tried to joke it away, but the tension was palpable. Others prayed to the old gods or the Seven for protection. Shireen and Robb shared a large command tent near the center of the host. She spent evenings there, helping him review the day's reports. The Great John, the Glovers, the Manderleys, and others would come in, stamping mud off their boots, discussing the next leg of the route or relaying rumors of fresh horrors beyond the wall. Shireen would inquire about supply counts, about whether local lords could provide additional fodder for the horses, about potential dwellings for the wounded if needed. The men had grown used to her voice of calm practicality among their councils, though some still appeared surprised that the queen would trouble herself with such details. Robb simply nodded in approval, grateful for her support. At times, in the solitude after the councils dispersed, they would lie together on the ground within the tent, a thin layer of furs insulating them from the cold earth. Robb would drape an arm around her, and they would speak in whispers, hearts pounding at the thought of what awaited. She asked if he truly believed they could withstand an enemy that rose from death itself, one that commanded winter and ice. He admitted fear but also hope. "We are the North," he said softly. "We are the descendants of the first men, tempered by endless winters. If the living cannot stand here, then no place in the realm is safe." Eventually, they reached the gift the land south of the wall granted to the Night's Watch ages ago. The air was sharper, the sense of foreboding heavier. The farmland lay mostly fallow in winter, with only bare trees marking property lines. Their scouts rushed back, announcing they had reached Castle Black and found the watch in dire straits. Robb ordered the host to make haste. Within hours, they saw the immense wall looming on the horizon. Ice blue, impossibly tall, dwarfing any fortress Shireen had ever known. In the pale winter light, it seemed like the edge of the world, a shining barrier that separated two realms, one of the living and one of the dead. As they approached Castle Black, they saw smoke rising from behind its walls, likely the watch's kitchens and forges. But no banners flapped from the ramparts. The old fortress looked tired, worn by centuries of neglect, battered by the climate and recent attacks. Night's Watch sentries peered down warily at the incoming army, but when they recognized the stark gray banner with the direwolf, they opened the gates. Jon Snow himself stood in the courtyard, clad in black, looking older and leaner than the boy Shireen had seen briefly at Winterfell. His dark hair was cropped shorter, and a gloom shadowed his gray eyes. Still, when Robb swung down from his horse and strode toward him, Jon's face lit with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. They clasped arms in a fierce embrace, as if 1,000 questions passed between them in that moment. Shireen, dismounting more slowly, watched the swirl of black-cloaked brothers and fur-clad northern soldiers merging in the courtyard. Jon's voice was rough from the cold. "I didn't think you'd truly come," he admitted. "So many lords have ignored our ravens. Even my father's friends in the south." He trailed off, swallowing emotion. Robb nodded grimly. "We're here. But tell us, how bad is it?" Jon's gaze flicked to the men around them, as though he struggled to find the right words. "Bad. Mance Rayder's host is scattered, but large. The wildlings move south of the wall in pockets, some scaling the ice, others crossing at Eastwatch. Many only want to flee the walkers, but the walkers themselves, they're real, Robb. We've lost too many brothers to them. They come in the night with the cold. They raise our dead against us." A chill that had nothing to do with the wind slid down Shireen's spine. She moved closer, listening intently. Jon continued, "We found dragonglass to be effective, but we have little of it. Valyrian steel also works. They shatter like ice when struck properly. But for everyone we kill, there are more. And the whites—" He paused, jaw tight. "At least the whites can be taken down by fire or destroyed like any corpse. But they're relentless. They don't feel pain." Robb exchanged a glance with his lords, many looking grim. The great Jon grunted, "We'll fight them head-on. They've not met the Umber men yet." But even his usual bluster rang hollow, faced with the unknown. Shireen stepped forward, doing her best to steady her voice. "We brought some obsidian from wherever we could scavenge it. Not much, but perhaps enough to forge arrowheads. Do you know how to set up a defense?" Jon nodded slowly. "We've been fortifying Castle Black as best we can. The other keeps are undermanned. We have Ser Alliser Thorn at Eastwatch, and we try to hold Shadow Tower, but the wildlings slip between. We might have to concentrate our forces here." They spent the rest of the day inspecting the fortress and meeting with the Night's Watch officers. It was a grim scene, men haggard from too many nights on watch, provisions running low, arms battered from constant skirmishes. The Black Brothers looked at the fresh northern soldiers with a mix of relief and caution. They had not expected such a sizable host to answer their calls. Some suspected the North might annex the Watch or demand concessions, but the presence of their king in the North was enough to quell such rumors. He was Eddard Stark's son, after all, and the Watch remembered Ned Stark's respect. Shireen found herself conversing with Samwell Tarly, a broad young man in black who stammered with nerves yet seemed brimming with knowledge. He told her the story of how he'd killed a White Walker with dragonglass, how the thing had screamed like the wind before shattering. She asked a dozen questions: how fast it moved, how it fought, whether it spoke. Samwell shook his head as if reliving a nightmare. "It was tall, thin, but stronger than any man. It carried an ice spear. It looked at me as though it were judging my very soul." Shireen shuddered, but pressed him for every detail, determined to glean anything that might help the northern host prepare. Robb held a war council in Castle Black's common hall. The Great Jon, Lord Glover, Lady Mormont, and others gathered with the Watch's senior officers: Maester Aemon, old and blind, Samwell Tarly, Ser Alliser Thorn, just returned from Eastwatch, and Jon Snow. Together, they discussed how best to withstand Mance Rayder's unstoppable wave and the undead threat. Tensions flared between Ser Alliser and some of the Northerners, but Robb forced them to see reason. The plan that emerged was risky. They would hold Castle Black at all costs, concentrate enough men at Eastwatch to deter infiltration, and station smaller forces at key points along the wall's base, using scouts to intercept wildling raiders. In addition, they would prepare caches of fire arrows, dragonglass weapons, and warhorn signals to warn of White Walker attacks. Every man understood that if Mance's full strength came in tandem with an undead onslaught, the Watch would be hard-pressed to hold the line, even with the Northern Army's reinforcement. But they had no choice. They could not abandon the wall. Jon pointed out that a magical oath lay upon the Watch, binding them to guard the realms of men. Robb quietly said that oath mattered to him as a Stark. Shireen added that the North could not thrive if the wall fell. Not a single voice dissented. The lines were drawn. They would fight in the harshest terrain, in the coldest nights, and they would endure. In the days that followed, Castle Black transformed into a hive of activity. Night's Watch forges burned at all hours, forging new arrowheads, repairing steel. Northern blacksmiths worked side by side with the Watch's smiths to shape obsidian into crude daggers and spear tips. Soldiers set up pickets on the heights of the wall, scanning the frosty horizon for any sign of movement. Others practiced with their new weapons in the yard, the ring of steel on steel, a near-constant echo. Shireen helped coordinate shipments of food from the caravans that trailed behind the main host. She was appalled at how meager the Watch's winter stores had been. They had simply never expected this level of prolonged siege. She personally saw to the distribution, ensuring the Black Brothers got proper rations, that the newly arrived Northern men also were fed, and that a surplus remained for an extended campaign. She found an unlikely ally in Marsh the Steward, who was both timid and meticulous, grateful for her help. At night, the temperature plummeted. Winds howled across the icy parapets, and Shireen would retreat inside the dim corridors of Castle Black, where she found a small chamber to share with Robb. They would speak quietly by candlelight, scanning maps or discussing the day's progress. Sometimes they simply fell silent, each weighed down by the gravity of what was coming. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion under Robb's eyes, the tension in his jaw. He carried the North's hopes on his shoulders and, by extension, the realm's. Yet in the hush of those evenings, when they drew close and let the candles' glow cast dancing shadows, Shireen felt the intangible bond that had grown between them. They had begun as strangers in an arranged marriage. Now they stood side by side, shaping the fate of thousands. All the while, messages continued to trickle in. One raven bore a frantic note from White Harbor. The Ironborn seemed to be stirring again near the coast, possibly testing the North's vulnerability now that its army had marched away. Another letter from the Freys demanded to know why the king in the North had abandoned the Riverlands to focus on foolish northern legends. It was all background noise, overshadowed by the immediate threat at the wall. One dawn, a horn blast shattered the fragile quiet. Shireen jolted awake in her chamber. Robb was already on his feet, pulling on a cloak and boots. The horn sounded again, urgent, echoing off the icy monolith that loomed above Castle Black. She followed Robb out into the courtyard, where men rushed to the gates, shouting. The Watch's rangers, who had ventured north of the wall the previous day, had returned in a battered state. 2 men, half dead with cold, carrying a third who was obviously gone. Shireen stood back as they collapsed, calling for help. Robb bent beside them, summoning the maesters. One of the half-dead rangers stared up, lips blue, eyes wide with terror. They're coming. Hundreds. Thousands. He coughed, spitting blood. The whites hunting in the open. We tried to go around. Mance's camp is further north, but the dead move faster. They'll be here days, maybe less. His head lulled to the side. Maester Eamon and Samwell Tarly hurried to tend him, but his breath faded. A hush fell over the courtyard, a hush that tasted of finality. The day they had dreaded was at hand. Robb stood slowly, turning to face the Watchers. Night's Watch, northern soldiers, all of them grim-faced. To the walls, he said softly, but his voice carried. Prepare the defenses. Rally every man. The dead come. Shireen felt the chill of those words as though an icy hand had gripped her spine. All her life, she had heard stories. Songs of heroes, tales of legends. Now she stood on the precipice of a battle that no song could truly capture. She forced herself to stand tall. Whatever fear gnawed at her, she could not show it. She was queen to the north, and these men needed courage. Chaos ensued as the fortress leapt into action. Men scrambled to final positions on the ramparts of Castle Black, hoisting barrels of pitch and placing braziers for fire. Others formed up in the courtyard, crossbows and obsidian-tipped spears at the ready. War horns bellowed, sending calls to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, though no one knew if help could arrive in time. Shireen found her place with Maester Eamon in the keep's command room, intending to coordinate messages and watch for developments. But her heart hammered, and part of her wished to be closer to Robb when the storm broke. Minutes ticked by like hours. Men clutched their weapons on the walls, peering into the swirling snow. The skies were steel gray, the wind fierce. Castle Black seemed to hold its breath. Then a distant roar, inhuman, reverberated across the tundra beyond the wall. Shireen's blood ran cold. There was a second roar, then silence. No horns, no drums, just the wind and that unholy sound echoing back. On the ramparts, Jon Snow exchanged a glance with Robb. They both understood that the time for doubt was over. The enemy was here. When the first whites appeared through the snowdrifts, they looked almost like silhouettes of men. But then the Watchers saw the glowing blue of dead eyes, the jerking gait of reanimated flesh. Clad in tattered wildling furs or ragged scraps of cloth from ancient times, they shambled forward relentlessly. More emerged behind them, then more, until the plain before the wall was a sea of the dead. And above them, glimpsed in the swirling white, moved taller figures of impossible grace and cold menace, White Walkers, ice crystallizing on their pale flesh, brandishing swords that caught the wan light in deadly gleams. A hush of terror clamped down on the men along the wall. Then Robb shouted, "Archers, fire at will." A volley of arrows arced overhead, many tipped with obsidian, black fletching against the gray sky. Some found their mark, striking whites, shattering them or dropping them where they stood. Others broke against the icy ground or lodged in lifeless flesh without effect. The wave of undead did not stop. They surged closer to the wall. Below in the courtyard, the defenders lit pitch and poured it through murder holes. Flames erupted, brightening the gloom. Whites burst into fire, some flailing silently as they burned, but more pressed on, clambering over the corpses of those that fell. Jon raced along the top of the ice, giving orders, while Robb held the main gate with a cadre of northern knights and watch brothers. The clang of steel on bone echoed a grotesque battle hymn. Shireen, from the keep's window, watched in horror as wave after wave of the undead hammered at the defenses. She forced her feet to move, to coordinate with the maesters sending signals to track whether the side gates held. Suddenly, a ghastly shriek split the air. One of the White Walkers advanced, brandishing an ice spear. A swirl of snow heralded its presence as it seemingly glided across the field. Arrows struck it but shattered uselessly. It raised its spear and flung it with lethal grace at a group of archers on the ramparts. Shireen heard the impact even from her vantage point. The spear transfixed 2 men at once, a ragged cry escaping them as they toppled. The White Walker's ice blade shimmered with malevolence. Jon, seeing this, sprinted across the rampart, unsheathing Longclaw, his Valyrian steel sword. The White Walker locked eyes with him from below, a silent, hate-filled stare. Another tilt of its head, and it advanced. Robb barked for a group of watchers with obsidian-laden crossbows to focus on that one. But as they did, more whites threw themselves at the main gate, hacking with inhuman strength. The gate shuddered. Shireen's pulse thundered as she realized that if the undead poured through, the fortress's interior would become a slaughterhouse. She rushed from the command post into the courtyard, ignoring the frantic calls of the maesters. Smoke and ash swirled, stinging her eyes. She saw the great Jon bellowing as he swung an axe at a cluster of whites that had breached a side door. Those that he struck fell to pieces, but more kept coming, clawing, biting. Nearby, a knight from House Serwyn screamed as a white tore at his throat before another soldier burned the creature with a torch. The stench of death and burning flesh was overpowering. Shireen pressed a hand to her mouth, forcing herself not to retch. She found a ring of guards trying to hold back half a dozen whites at the base of the stairwell. Heart pounding, she grabbed a fallen spear with an obsidian tip. The weight felt alien in her hands. She had sparred with wooden swords for practice, but never faced a real enemy. The whites lunged. The guards slammed them back with shields. One white staggered in her direction, arms outstretched, eyes glowing with unnatural light. She felt panic threaten to paralyze her, but she forced herself to thrust with the spear. The point drove into the white's chest. It hissed, then collapsed into a heap of limbs that twitched before going still. She stood there panting, trying not to scream. A sudden crash from the gate behind her. The main gate splintered. Robb's voice rang out over the tumult. "Hold them! Form ranks!" The northern soldiers rallied, forming a shield wall as whites began crawling through the broken timbers. Robb waded forward, sword raised. Gray wind snarled at his side, tearing into the undead that pressed in. Shireen watched her husband in the thick of it, hacking off limbs that kept moving after they fell, thrusting at skulls until they burst. Flames from overhead poured down, charring a swath of enemies, but the remainder kept coming. A White Walker stepped through the breach, tall and regal in its icy malevolence, frost crackling off its body. Shireen's breath caught. Robb lunged, swinging his sword in a broad arc. The blade met the White Walker's own weapon, a shriek of unnatural sound bursting forth as metal clashed with living ice. Sparks of frost shimmered in the air. The Walker shoved Robb back, impossibly strong. Robb stumbled, bracing himself just in time to parry a second blow. Gray wind leapt, but the Walker's backhanded swing knocked the direwolf aside with a pained yelp. Shireen's heart lurched. She started to move forward, but the press of battling men and whites made it impossible. She could only watch as Robb struggled to hold his ground. The White Walker advanced again, the chill around it so intense that frost formed on Robb's cloak. He struck out once more, steel meeting ice in a blaze of shrieking friction. Then, before it could retaliate, a crossbow bolt tipped in dragaglass whizzed through the air, striking the Walker in the shoulder. It let out a hellish hiss, turning its eerie gaze on the archer who had loosed the shot, a young soldier from House Mormont. The Walker's shoulder cracked, fracturing with blue lines of freezing. Robb seized the moment, plunging his sword forward. The blade bit deep, and the White Walker's body froze, then shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Robb stood panting, steam rising from his mouth in heavy bursts, eyes wide with the shock of triumph. Yet even as it fell, more whites poured in. The defenders held as best they could. Jon was on the ramparts, dueling another walker with Longclaw. The Greyjoy's roars of rage echoed through the courtyard. Fires blazed around them. Shireen found herself battling her own terror, unable to look away from the carnage. She stabbed another white that lurched close, and it fell lifeless at her feet. Men died by the dozen, Black brothers and Northerners both, their screams lost in the cacophony. Shireen saw a figure in black set ablaze by a pitcher of flaming pitch, shrieking as he plummeted from the rampart, wreathed in unholy flames. Minutes or hours, she couldn't tell, passed in a blur of horror. The defenders gradually pressed the undead back from the shattered gate, forming ranks that scythed through the swarm with dragonglass-tipped weapons and a near-suicidal will to live. Flames from the braziers cut off some of the whites' advance. A few battered sections of the fortress had to be abandoned, but the main courtyard was held. Then, as quickly as they had come, the whites began to retreat, staggering back into the swirling snow as though some silent command had recalled them. The defenders, battered and bleeding, did not pursue. A hush of disbelief descended, broken only by the moans of the dying. Robb, sword red with frozen gore, looked around wildly as though expecting another wave. But none came. The White Walkers had melted back into the night, leaving behind heaps of broken corpses. Shireen sagged against the courtyard wall, dropping her spear. She realized her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The first battle was over, if it could be called a victory. Castle Black still stood, but the cost was staggering. Bodies littered the snow, some twitching with leftover necromancy, requiring a final blow or a touch of fire to keep them from rising again. Robb limped to her side, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. A shallow cut bled from his upper arm. She reached trembling fingers to it, wanting to confirm he was truly alive. He managed a nod, swallowing hard. We held. For now. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to his chest, his armor cold and spattered with unthinkable filth. How many times can we do this? She whispered. He exhaled, voice husky. As many times as we must. Men began the grim work of gathering the dead, both whites and the fallen allies. Pyres would be lit, for that was the only way to ensure the whites would not rise again, and it was the best way to honor the Black brothers who had died in defense of the realm. The northern soldiers stoically accepted that they had stepped into a war beyond mortal experience. Shireen joined others tending to the wounded, steeling herself at the sight of gaping wounds, blackened frostbite, and the horror shining in men's eyes. Some injuries ran deeper than flesh. Dawn came pale and wan, revealing the full extent of the carnage. The courtyard was churned mud, bloody slush soaking into the ground. The men who could still stand gathered for a brief muster. Jon Snow approached with Longclaw sheathed, eyes hollow. He exchanged a look with Robb, then said, "They'll return. Perhaps in greater numbers." Robb nodded, looking across the battered ramparts. "We'll be ready." He glanced at Shireen, who stood among the survivors, trying to project some measure of calm. "We have to be." Thus began the long siege at the wall. Over the coming days and nights, the dead came again. And again. Sometimes in small raids that tested the defenses. Other times in full assaults that left Castle Black teetering on the brink. The defenders learned to adapt, to rely heavily on fire and dragonglass. Shireen fought to keep the army supplied, to organize triage for the wounded. She wrote urgent letters to any lords in the north who had not yet arrived, pleading for reinforcements, though she had no illusions that many more men would come in the dead of winter. Word spread that Mance Rayder's wildlings were battling the White Walkers as well, just farther north, seeking a path around to the weaker points of the wall. No one could confirm the fate of Mance himself. Perhaps, in a grim twist of fate, the Watch's ancient foes were now forced to fight a common enemy. Shireen thought it ironic that only a horror like this could unite sworn enemies, but she took no solace in that knowledge. She stood with Robb upon the ice ramparts one night, gazing out over a field of frozen corpses left behind from the last assault, some partially entombed in drifts. A stark moonlight illuminated the carnage. "We cannot hold forever," Robb admitted quietly, a cloud of breath escaping his lips. "If the realm does not join us soon." She placed a hand on his arm. "We will hold as long as we must, until the south heeds us or the threat is ended." He turned, resting his forehead against hers, the wind tangling his hair. "They may never come. Stannis is consumed with his war in the south. The Lannisters care only for their throne. My mother's letters to the Tullus and others went unanswered." Shireen bit her lip, the taste of salt from tears she refused to let fall. "Then the north will stand alone, for all the living. It's what my father said once, if you must do your duty, then do it no matter who stands with you." His eyes, as gray as a winter sky, flickered with determination. "Then we'll fight until our last breath." She nodded, letting the hush of the wall surround them. Below, Grey Wind prowled the courtyard, sniffing among the wounded. Nearby, the men who had once only spoken of politics and alliances now faced a nightmare of ice and death. The War of the Five Kings felt distant and petty in comparison. Here, at the edge of the world, they fought for survival itself. If they failed, an endless night would descend upon the realm, and no castle or crown would stand against it. So they braced themselves for the next onslaught, hearts beating in time with the land they loved. Above them, the moon shone, pale and cold, and the wall towered, a monument to the realm's oldest fears. Yet in the hearts of those who kept watch on that ancient ice, a flicker of hope still glimmered. A hope born of unity of House Stark and House Baratheon joined in defiance of an enemy that neither storms nor winter could quell. For in the darkness of unrelenting winter, even the faintest light can guide the lost toward dawn if only they endure. And endure they would, as long as breath and blood remained in them, forging a new legend at the world's end, a testament to the gentle yet unshakable pact that had begun in Winterfell and led them all to stand unbowed against the coming night.